Hi, everyone. Welcome to the EdUP AI podcast. I am Jason Gulia, and we are going to dedicate our time to really thinking about artificial intelligence and education and try to figure out just how to understand, how to make heads and tails of what's going on. And I'm really excited today because I'm talking to a close friend of mine who is awesome. So his name is Ephraim Lerner. So he is an organizational coach, and he's also my go-to person for thinking about how organizations work. And he has completed a book. It is in the process of being made. It is called Change Starts Here, and it is coming. I really, really hope so. This coming summer, and I can give everyone a link so you can kind of find it. You can pre-order now. So, Ephraim, welcome. How are you, and how are things going?
Thanks so much, Jason. Really kind of you. And yeah, doing well, doing really well. It's exciting to be able to hear about the book and hopefully, like you said, out there in the summer, which has been really exciting. But yeah, just really nice to be able to connect in this type of a platform with your audience.
Yeah, and congratulations on it. It's such a, and you know this, it is such a slog to get that book done, get it out there, especially with academic publishing, and yours is coming from Routledge. So there's so many hands in the book at a certain point. It's such a long process. So let's dive in. One of the things that I think we sometimes lose touch with is with AI and how it's developing and how schools are or are not adapting. We think a lot about, I think, the classroom. We think about individual use cases. But one of the things we really need to think about is how organizations change or don't change. So I don't know if you just want to weigh in on what you see happening right now with organizations changing, not changing, trying to change, and what this means for AI in education.
It's a great question. And I think when we think about artificial intelligence, one of the things that I've noticed is that it forces us to ask some very difficult questions. It asks us to be willing and to even think about leaving our comfort of what we're used to and thinking about a new perspective, a new reality that we're not necessarily so comfortable or used to. And when we think about organizations are complex. And when we think about change within organizations, even on an individual level, a human being is so complex. Now imagine two human beings or a group of humans together, when we're coming together to think about a change as monumental as AI, artificial intelligence, and how that might change not just how we operate and think about what we do day in, day out, but the actual goals themselves. It gets us to question that at a very fundamental level. And if we have psychological safety, which is a concept that's definitely been brought to the fore from Amy Edmondson, the idea of feeling safe to be able to risk and to take take on the unknown and learn and adapt and grow as an organization. That's quite straightforward. It's when there's a lot of complexity to that and a lot of emotions that those bigger changes can cause us to think about, that it makes it harder for us to be able to move and adapt and evolve. And as human beings, as organizations, as groups, it's almost impossible not to always be changing in some way. But when it comes to ourselves or when it comes to how we operate, those changes can have massive implications for how we operate with each other, how we feel confident, how safe we might feel when it comes to those bigger and more daunting changes.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question about your language. All right, because I think this sort of gets at one of the big, maybe paradox, puzzle. I don't know how we want to think about it, but when you were going over that, you use we and our a lot, right? You saying that, leaving our comfort, thinking about what we do. So who is the we, the our of that sentence? So, and I think that's key, especially with thinking about education, right? Is it students? Is it faculty? Is it administrators? Is it all kind of intertwined at different levels? Because that's one of the big questions, right? If we are going to adapt organizations and get them past that comfort zone, who is the we? Who's the R? Who is doing that pushing? And kind of like, so I guess in general, like, where does change need to come from in these organizations, especially with education?
So it's a great point, and I think when we think about education, there are so many different we, us, are. There's so many different people involved in education. You've got the parents, you've got the teachers, you've got staff members, you've got leaders, you've got students, you've got those on the periphery who we might not often think about, but the community that usually supports an educational organization or institution. It could be in higher education. You've got past, graduates of the university or the college. There's so many different factors, and that also comes with so many different expectations. And the reason why I'm using the language of we or our or us is because if we speak on an individual level, it's very easy or relatively easy for us as an individual to make our own choice. But when our choice affects so many other people, and then it's not just our choice, it's as a choice of us as a collective, it can become so easy to lose track of other people's feelings and and areas of safety. You mentioned change in our book. The book I've written is together with an amazing human being and just a great educator, Shane Leaning. And Shane and I, we share we share this quite regularly, that the first step that we believe in any change process is someone who's willing to be the one that puts themselves on the line. Now that's usually someone who has a confidence, power, or influence to really go confidently and change the status quo or move towards something different to what the status quo is. To be able to do that, what can often happen is that a leader or an individual who has that power, level of control or respect, or they see so much of a need to move from what where we're coming from to change it and to do something different, that they're willing to put their neck on the line. But to be able to do that, the danger is that sometimes that perceived challenge that they see, this is the perceived challenge that we have. Now we need to move that towards something different. It can be stopping and starting with that person. So in change management, not just in education, but in general, I think there's a very well-known study from McKinsey around change change initiatives not lasting more than 3 years. 80% of change initiatives don't last more than 3 years. And the big piece around that, there's a meta-analysis that was done on this. Quite a few different studies that were looked at, which is ownership and responsibility. And when change is happening from a group of individuals, but we don't feel that as the collective on the ground, whether it's staff or students or parents, for that change to last, it's quite unlikely, because for the people that's going to affect the most, people on the ground, it needs to matter to them and needs to be something that they feel is theirs as well. So when it comes to change, there's a lot of complexity to that, obviously, but the we, the us, the are is crucial, because if it's just on an individual level where let's say a leader decides, using the example of artificial intelligence, that they're going to drive that change, their voice can very easily be the one that drowns out everything else. But if we're thinking more long term, sustainable change that's ours, it needs to represent the collective. It can't just be driven by one individual or a group of individuals who are disconnected from the realities on the ground.
Yeah, and there are two things in your answers that I think are so key. One, which you mentioned earlier, and I really want to bring back into the conversation because I think that it's so pivotal to what you're talking about, which is the encouragement or even the creation of psychological safety. And I think that many of us, when thinking about educational institutions, which really are these kind of massive organizations in many ways, we think about that from the student perspective. We think about that from how can you encourage students to feel psychologically safe. And often what we lose touch with is that faculty need that too. Administrators need that too, right? There are so many organizations, so many educational institutions when faculty either don't feel psychologically safe to play with something, right, or do something different, or they don't feel the pressure to, and that's where the balance is, right? And especially colleges and universities, to be totally frank, they suck at this. This is not something that we excel at, being able to change and adapt in a certain way. And it's to the point that it's sort of a joke that colleges don't change. And that's one of the big things I think we need to think a lot about as AI adapts and our students have it and are using it and are being asked to use it for work. So creating that kind of psychological safety, I think, is so key. And I do think that a huge part of that is, as you mentioned, and citing McKinsey and everyone else, that feeling of ownership. And I was thinking a lot about this recently because, and I know we're just learning about it, we're just getting information, and I'm not going to rush to any conclusions, but with what's happening with California State University, right? They've now partnered with OpenAI and are giving access to ChatGPT EDU to basically, I think it's about 500,000 people. Once you get faculty, once you get students, it's a huge thing. And again, one of the things that I'm trying to learn about is what that decision was like organizationally. Like, who was included in this organization, in this decision, right? And that's where things get complicated, and especially with higher ed. And although I don't want to say especially, because it might be the case with K-12 as well, I just don't know as much about it, so I don't want to assume that. But there are so many hands in the cookie pot, right? In the cookie jar, there are so many. If you have a decision like that, which is, over 18 months and it's like $16-17 million, this is a big decision. As an outsider looking in, and I don't know as an insider if the vantage point is different, but even just saying who made that decision is hard. Right? It's like hard to figure out because you look at it and you kind of see, the chancellor, but also the government was involved, right? So Newsom was a part of it. And then also there's the accelerator board, and there are a bunch of CEOs and business leaders, and that was sort of a part of it. And at a certain point, your head just it just can't figure out who made that decision, right? And I don't know if you're a faculty member in the CSU system, if it's any clearer. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I have people who've reached out to me and talked to me from the system and said, we don't know where that came from. They were told in an email. Like, that's it. They got basically the same notification we did. And my worry, and I won't say this as a conclusion because we're still learning about it and learning about what that deal is going to look like. But my worry is that if organizations follow suit with that and don't really think about ownership, they're going to go in and put in this time, put in this money, and it's not going to get past that 3-year part, right? Because they wouldn't have done something that either they kind of built buy-in to or that there was already buy-in to. You don't want to get something. You don't want to buy a tool that then doesn't get used. that doesn't help anyone. It just sits there. And actually can be a negative influence because now you're going to go and you're going to lay people off or whatever, right? Do whatever you're going to do to now accommodate that $16-17 million. So I want to phrase this as the question. So if you're someone within an educational institution, how do you manage that feeling of ownership? Is it just a matter of talking to people and getting a sense of what the buy-in is already for and kind of moving in that direction? Or do you have ways of thinking about, if you're in an educational institution, starting to kind of nudge cultural change, right? Is that something that you can start to do, or how do you see that dynamic working out?
I think you've brought up some really powerful points, and I think on my end, what I've heard is when it comes to education, and especially in higher ed, when we are speaking about something like you've mentioned around AI, there's a real perception of psychological safety. We speak about psychological safety, for example, and ownership. It's very easy in those bigger, larger organizations where you've got, you said that potentially be impacting 500,000 people. Like that type of level or sheer number of people, the voices of individuals can get very easily lost, and often the people that do get forgotten are those that it affects the most on the ground. Because for a CEO or for a leader to be able to make a decision, that's one thing, but for a teacher or a parent or a student in the classroom who's thinking about how this is going to impact them, there's decisions can be made is that going to have the desired impact that you want it to? And especially with AI, where there's a lot of uncertainty, to be psychologically safe means you're willing to look past and acknowledge the pain of leaving behind what you're comfortable with to go and choose something new and different that you haven't experienced before. Now, if it's a technology, that can sometimes be built on previous experiences with technology in general. But when it comes to a decision that's going to impact you in a very strong way, the more likely you are to be feeling like you're being included in the conversation. And the earlier that happens, the more likely you will be to feel like it is yours and it has an impact on you and your day-to-day life, and you're able to shape its use for you and for your team, or for your classroom, or for your school. The danger is that the conversation often starts almost when that decision is already being made, or the decision's already been made, and now it's about implementation. And what Shane and I speak about in our book, and in general with our organization called Work Collaborative, it's how do we embed the people who are a part of these conversations into this broader conversation? Because if we come in with set answers or set responses or an idea of what we want, it can be very easy to lose the very people we're trying to bring alongside. Because when we are bringing them on, it's too late into the game. They don't feel like it's theirs anymore. But if we can go at the very outset and realize that stage that we spoke about before, where yes, we'll have someone who initiates a change. It might be in our language, we call it the sponsor, the person who, either is a school or an organization or a leader, who has the power, responsibility, or confidence to be able to move forward and say, okay, this needs to be something we look forward to. Is that starting a conversation, or is that ending a conversation? How often are we going into an organizational change and thinking about an idea, a set idea from a very limited perspective, and not being aware that there's immediately going to be different perspectives that needs to be considered? And jumping straight from the perceived challenge straight to a decision can be quite damaging. Whereas if we build, and we have a model that we use in our book, but also across our organization in Work Collaborative. And again, it's not about the model. I think a lot of there's so many models that exist in change management or in general in education. And what we've posed it as is more of an opportunity, a framework, and people can take it apart. They can do what they like with it. It's an open source model. We want it to be tweaked and adapted for people's needs. But the main key idea for us is that the first stage needs to be from when we go to from a sponsor, from a person who's perceiving the challenge. It needs to be able to first think about connection and discovering, because if we come from a limited perspective, it's very easy to lose the very heart and soul of what we're trying to do with the people we're trying to make sure feel like this is their change as much as it is ours, at a leadership level or at a sponsors level. So bringing that, embedding that into the process, connecting and discovering, and expanding out, and then going back in based on the British Designs double diamond, just being able to expand our thinking and then go slowly inwards to be able to think, how can this apply to a very specific scenario, and how can this be our community aligned goal where everyone feels like this is something they're working towards together. I think the danger with AI is that we can very easily think we need the answers, when really it's just about having better conversations together and asking the right questions.
And I want to put pressure on that because I think it's so key. A lot of the ways that organizations do or do not adapt comes down to communication. In many ways, that's where we sort of end up. And it's not just how we communicate, which is pivotal, but also when we communicate, right? At what point do we open that door? Right? Do we actually allow people in? Because if you have that conversation after something's already been done, things are already moving or about to move, like that doesn't help you out. And then also think about how we communicate with each other. And this is something that I think is so pivotal, because, and part of this too is how so much of the discourse about AI has linked with social media, right? From the very beginning, especially with something like ChatGPT, right? OpenAI, yes, it is an AI company. It also is kind of run like a social media company, right? It feels organizationally like that. All right, it's about just stirring the pot, getting conversation out there, very Twitter based, very much like that's how it got popular. So it's sort of run that way. And so, and think that many of us, and I've had this experience, I had an experience probably it was about last year. I went in, I was doing a training on AI for educators, and it was primarily faculty were in the room. There were some administrators, but it was mostly talking about what AI means for teaching. And I got a few minutes in, and I had someone who was already angry at me, right? Going in, and they were already angry at me, right? From the very beginning, right? As soon as I started talking, as soon as it became clear that that's what I was talking about, they were angry, even before listening to me. Right, even before having that conversation. And we're going into these conversations where, we have these either or fallacies. Either you embrace AI or you resist AI. And we have all these ways of communicating, which really are political at the heart of it. Right. I don't mean like US politics versus UK politics or anything like that, but like having a discourse of power baked into them. And I think often what happens, this isn't necessarily have to be the case, but it often is the case, is we dig our heels in. We're not listening to each other. Right. And that's a big organizational obstacle, that if you want an organization that's actually going to change and adapt, you need to get past that. You need to get past those fallacies. There needs to be empathy. And so for me, without empathy, you're really not communicating. Without communicating, you're really not adapting. And if you're not adapting, you're really not changing. Like for me, that empathetic connection is foundational to what you're talking about. Is that sort of how you see things going, or how you see things, or am I reducing it too much?
No. I love how you've broken it down. I think there's a simplicity in that, and simplicity in this situation, I think, is brilliant. We need that. We need that clarity. Where I think the conversation around artificial intelligence, after a certain point in um in like the grand scheme of things, it's only been a year and a half, 2 years, where ChatGPT, November 2021, I think it was 22. I'm just like, my brain is like, all these years are coming like all at once. But the very fact that we've moved, so it's 20, I think it was 22, right? The 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 shift in mentality, where there's almost this visceral response to artificial intelligence before we've even had the conversation, I think is indicative of something a lot deeper. It's that insecurity that might be under the surface, and being able to feel like we can work together with other people. Because if we can't have that empathy, then how can we have these conversations? And if we can't have these conversations, then how we ever expect to change and leave what we're holding on to? It's like the story of the parable of the monkey. How we trap a monkey is by like you put a bit of food into a cage, and when the monkey's got their hand trapped, they can't move it out. They're stuck. It's the ability to let go. But how often what we're holding on to sometimes is our own insecurities, and to feel safe enough to let go of that requires a deep sense of trust and safety. And to build that safety is not easy, especially when it's coming to something so fundamental. And we speak, going back to that bigger question we spoke about around higher education and AI, like, well, education in general, the role of educators has been, we've lost I'll use the words from Shane, my co-author, the organizational confidence in education has been demolished over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Our our confidence is being led often by external advisors or people who are outside of our sector, from and well intentioned as well. I don't mean to knock them at all. I think they've got the best of intentions, but it's what that can have on an impact level internally on our organizations is we've now passed over the baton to these larger, massive organizations. So whether it's a government, a government organization, or something like OpenAI, where they have a very different driving force between what they're trying to do and what their benefits are. Ultimately, I know there's an ongoing conversation around that, is what the purpose is. And if the data, the security, the very essence of what makes us is almost up for sale, and the goals that we have within our organizations, in order to be able to continue surviving on a financial level, what do we give up in the process? And I don't think it's a bad thing to have these conversations. I think it's actually forcing us to think about those deeper questions that have been around for a long time. But the difficulty is who's making those decisions, and are the people that are digging their heels in, are they feeling safe enough to be able to let go for a moment? And how can we allow them to feel safe to be able to go, let go and feel like it's theirs? And my question when it comes to AI for those larger organizations is, are they genuinely listening to students, to parents, to to staff members, to educators in the classrooms? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think that's been a conscious enough effort, because they're breaking year after year. We're breaking. The AI has developed, generative AI has developed significantly over the last 6 months to a year, and even more so, the last 2 years. And that's just going to continue to grow. But I don't think that in education that necessarily bodes well for us if we're losing our voice for the sector. And yeah, that I think is something that definitely needs to be a conscious part of our psychology when we're looking at change like that on a district level or on a multi-school level, where those voices can so easily get lost. Those unique cultures and values that we cherish can very easily get lost if we aren't careful about that. But are we giving enough space for those voices to be heard? That is the real question, I think, when it comes to this.
And that's where we're going to have to end. That's right around the end of our conversation. But these two questions that you end with are so pivotal. Question number one, are they listening? Right? Whoever is making the decision, are they listening? And that means creating a space for people to speak, creating that psychological safety, and then making a decision and not just bringing them into the conversation after that decision has already been made. I think that's so key. And the other question I see in the background of what you're thinking about and talking about is, are we being self-reflective? Are we taking the chance and actually being self-aware, right? And this comes back to the question about emotions, right? Certain things being visceral. You say AI and those hairs automatically bristle and people are excited or angry or sad, and suddenly like mentally they're in a dystopic novel, or like it's just all these things automatically happen as soon as you bring that to the conversation. And so we need to be self-aware about why that is happening. It doesn't mean you dismiss the emotions, quite the opposite. It means you work your way through them. It means you and then you think about purpose, you think about being conscious. And I think those two questions, are they listening, whoever's the decider, are they listening? And are we being reflective, right? Are we being conscious? I think those are key. I think that's that's how you, having those questions and carrying them with you, I think has to be at least a huge part of the secret of actually changing as an organization. So thank you so much, Ephraim. Thank you for giving us your knowledge and helping us work through just how complicated the questions around organizational change and AI actually are. And again, for any listeners, Ephraim's book is coming out in August, right, in this summer, and it is going to be Change Starts Here. So again, I'll give you the link. You can go buy it, you can pre-order it. And Ephraim, thank you so much for coming and chatting.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, Jason.